Do, 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 do. Sorry, 1 second. Why? 1 second. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. There we go. Okay, can you guys see that okay?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. Okay, so I'm going to be here talking about congressional advocacy 101. And, we're a pretty small group. So if you have questions as I'm going through, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat or even come off mute. And I will say this is also a very high level presentation. So feel free to ask me to dig into something a little bit more or go a little deeper, and I'd be happy to. So starting off the basics, we can kind of divide congressional advocacy into sort of two buckets, one being legislative advocacy and the other being appropriations related advocacy. Legislative advocacy looks like working to pass a piece of legislation or prevent a piece of legislation from being passed, or you might want to change certain language in the bill, maybe have them include something, take it out. That just refers to essentially the process of getting a bill passed. Appropriations advocacy is advocating for funding for specific programs in the federal budget, or in some cases, advocating for programs to not be funded. So this essentially has to do not with passing legislation, but just getting federal dollars allocated to things that you think they should be allocated to. And so this is I think the best video to show an overview of how a bill becomes a law. I don't know if that I shared my screen to share the audio. So I'm just going to stop sharing and then reshare to make sure that you guys can hear the video. So give me one moment. I should have thought about that before. There we go. Okay. Can you guys hear that?
You sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm gonna live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, I don't know if anyone has seen that video before, but Schoolhouse Rock is always a classic. Okay, so moving on. So how do you advocate for a bill? So this is as close to as comprehensive as I can get about the kinds of advocacy that's most relevant to folks that are, working for nonprofits or in that space. So there's the most obvious, which is direct advocacy. So meeting with your congressional offices, whether that's virtually or in person. You can also call, email, or even physically mail your members of Congress. Educating the public, so social media campaigns or galvanizing other people to also reach out to their members of Congress. This is a good way to raise awareness about your issue. And then also in coalitions, so working with other organizations that have shared interests to kind of build network to garner more support. They can help you educate the public and also get others to also reach out to their members of Congress. Coalitions can also do sign-on letters. So essentially, you'll have a letter about your specific issue with your policy ask, and then organizations can sign on, and you'll send that to the relevant members of Congress, which shows them, these 50 organizations really care about this issue, and it's much more powerful than, just an individual reaching out about an issue or a handful of individuals reaching out. And then lastly are kind of public forums. So you could, during town halls, which usually happen most commonly during the summer recess that members of Congress have, they'll host town halls back in their home districts, which is an opportunity to directly ask members of Congress questions about issues that you feel strongly about. Obviously, rallies is another way, whether it's in your district or you're in DC outside the Capitol building. Physically being in a space is obviously something that's really hard to ignore. And then lastly, testifying, if, your bill comes to a hearing or testifying in front of a committee. So these are also pulled from, I shared with Maggie some of the policy priorities that they shared during AIDS Watch, which was this past week. And AIDS Watch is the largest HIV/AIDS related conference. So their policy asks around HIV/AIDS are pretty comprehensive. SIECUS is kind of tangentially involved in HIV/AIDS advocacy. So I just highlighted in buckets kind of the things that they're advocating for. So the first kind of category is around voting rights and discrimination, increasing access to PrEP and PEP. So the PrEP Access and Coverage Act, also non-discriminations protections, which would, decriminalize or HIV or reduce discrimination around HIV, improving access to healthcare. Obviously, this is kind of a broader category, but improving access to healthcare for everyone obviously would also help those who are more vulnerable or who have health issues. A rising tide lifts all ships. Protecting LGBTQ populations. Transgender women are among, as I'm sure you guys know, the most vulnerable populations for HIV. So bills that would stop transgender murder epidemic, or also including data around the LGBTQ population. And then lastly, which is the bill that SIECUS advocates for, is increasing access to comprehensive sex ed. Sex education is a really critical tool for HIV prevention and education. And I'll kind of pause here for a minute. Anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments before I keep going?
I did have a question, kind of related to your last slide about different ways that you can talk to legislators about and advocate for bills. So a couple weeks ago, we actually had a member of the North Carolina General Assembly who dropped in for the action hour, and they mentioned that at least in North Carolina, emails to your representatives are a lot more effective because they don't always like hear the voicemails, but they definitely read the emails. And I was just wondering if you, from your experience, have any insight about some ways that people can do advocacy from North Carolina and not being in DC, and what is people are like kind of most likely to hear.
Yeah, so all members of Congress, and I cover this at the end, but have multiple ways of contacting them. So if you know your member of Congress, I also included the link to where you can put in your address and figure out who your senators and representatives are. They will usually either have like a contact form or an email address that you can directly reach out to. And if you send them like an email or even a physical piece of mail, the legislative correspondence, so obviously the member of Congress is not reading all of these, but someone from the office has to eventually get back to you. They might just give you a stock response, especially if it's for an issue that a lot of people are contacting their office about. They might just have a stock response, but they do have to read your message within like a relatively timely manner and get back to you, because there are people within congressional offices whose whole job is just reviewing constituent correspondence. They're answering phones, they're opening letters, they're answering emails. Their whole job is about communicating with constituents. And if they get, let's say, like 1,000 emails about a particular policy issue, they're going to then raise that to other staffers who'll probably raise that to the member of Congress. So it's often a numbers game, unless it's something that you get lucky that maybe your congressman really cares about, or it's an issue that's very highly relevant to your state or district. But often it is numbers. And I will at the end, I'll talk a little bit about what kind of direct outreach looks like.
Thanks for
Does
that.
that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that was great.
Okay. Is this the right slide? Okay. Yes. So now moving on to kind of the appropriation stuff. This is a very abbreviated process of the federal budget process, which is honestly a very messy, complicated thing. It never happens when it's supposed to happen. And this year in particular has been particularly drawn out. The fiscal year ends at the end of September. So that is generally the deadline that the government has to fund the year by. That was in, the government had until October 1st of this past year, 2023, to do their fiscal year 2024 funding. They are now just nearing the finish line. So we are several months past the deadline. So this is a process that historically, I don't think it's happened on time since President Clinton was in power. So it starts off with the president submitting his budget proposal. And this will basically include all of the funding that the president, how he thinks or she thinks the money should be allocated. And this is developed by the Office of Management of Budget. They will work with not only the different federal agencies, but also the president, the White House, to figure out what kinds of priorities he has. And then they'll release it. So they just released President Biden's budget, like I think last week or the week before. And then also when they release it, they will highlight certain priorities saying, oh, the president has really prioritized reproductive justice or workforce development, whatever it may be. Then the proposed funding is divided among the 12 subcommittees. So each subcommittee basically is connected to one of the appropriations bills. There are 12 bills for each different sector of government. So you have your, Department of Defense funding. You have labor, health, and human services is all like one bill. Different areas, each has their own bill. Then the House and Senate create their own budget resolutions, which then have to be negotiated and merged. And as we saw in the How a Bill Becomes a Law video, both houses have to pass a single version of each funding bill. This is kind of where the process tends to get sticky, as we've seen recently. Sometimes Congress has to do something called a continuing resolution, which is basically kicking the can down the road for the funding deadline. So they'll just keep extending that October 1st deadline to give them more time. And in the meantime, everything stays funded at the levels that it was previously funded. Then once both houses have passed their funding bill, then Congress will send the approved funding bills to the president to sign or veto. And usually by that point, the president is also involved kind of in the negotiation process, saying, things that he would like to see or not see in the bills that he will then direct his party to prioritize as they're drafting these bills. Any questions about this process before we go to the next slide? Okay. So appropriations advocacy, this is kind of where the opportunities are to engage into the budget process. Again, this is like somewhat high level, so there might be more opportunities in this, but these are kind of, I feel like the major pressure points of, where SIECUS does advocacy or where even individuals have an opportunity. So as I mentioned, the appropriations process generally kicks off with the president's budget, which is developed by the White House Office of Management and Budget. And so while OMB is working with the White House to develop that budget, it is possible to send a letter to OMB saying, hey, we would really like to see these priorities included in the president's budget. Then after that, the president's budget is out, and now this appropriations request, that is where we currently are in the funding process. So before the House and Senate draft their proposals, you can submit a funding request for a specific program directly to an office. So if you're a constituent, you would submit this directly to your representatives and your senators saying, dear Senator, I would really like to see this program funded because of XYZ reason. And usually you want to make the argument that it would directly help people in your district or state. They're going to want to see the connection to the people that they represent. Then around the same time, there are Dear Colleague letters happening in Congress. So the way that a Dear Colleague works is that it's written by a member of Congress or their office, and it's written to the appropriators. So the people that are on the appropriations committee, which is the committee that deals with the appropriations process. So the member of Congress's office will say, we really think these things should be funded, and they'll circulate it to other offices, which is why it's called a Dear Colleague, because it's a member of Congress writing to other members. And then people can sign on, and then that will be sent to the appropriators. So they can see that, before they even get any legislation drafted, they can see, 50 members of the House really support this funding measure. Then there's organization sign-on letters. So just like legislative advocacy, organization sign-on letters can also be sent to appropriators. So for example, SIECUS recently did a sign-on letter for the FY 2025 appropriations, which is the process that had just started. With our funding priorities, we circulated it amongst the coalitions that we're a part of. I think around 50 organizations signed on. And then we shared that with appropriations members saying, hey, these X organizations signed on. We also shared it with offices that we are friendly with or have a relationship with, just to let them know that there is organizational backing for these issues. Lastly, you can do direct outreach at any time. So as long as the process is still in motion, you can do all of the things that kind of what I talked about with legislative advocacy. You can do direct outreach in many ways, just to essentially let members of Congress know that you feel really strongly about certain appropriations priorities. I'll pause here again to see if folks have questions. Okay. So this is also pulled from the great resources that AIDS United has at AIDS Watch. And these are their primary appropriations priorities. So there's the Ryan White program, which is those communities that are most impacted by HIV and provides funding for access to essential services for them. Obviously, funding for PrEP and PEP and treatment as prevention services and messaging for priority HIV populations. Housing for people that are living with HIV/AIDS, the HOPWA program. Then we also have the AIDS education and training centers, which help to basically train healthcare workers to deal with HIV and other public health issues. Then funding for addressing the syndemic, which is the intersecting HIV, hepatitis, and overdose syndemics. And then removing federal barriers to federal funding for harm reduction programs, the Minority AIDS Initiative and supplemental ending the epidemic funding, the Indian Health Service, which supports Indigenous people that are living with HIV. And then lastly, like I mentioned before, more broader healthcare support measures, opposing efforts to undercut Medicaid and supporting efforts to help close the Medicaid coverage gap. And so these are SIECUS's appropriations priorities, which are also shared with HIV and AIDS organizations. We are part of the Federal AIDS Policy Partnership, and these two programs are also a funding priority for that group. But these are the two programs that we do a lot of advocacy around, that the coalitions that we're a part of do advocacy around. So I wanted to go a little bit more in depth on these. So the first is the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program, which is under the Office of Population Affairs in the Department of Health and Human Services. And it's a national evidence-based grant program that helps to fund organizations working to prevent teen pregnancy, as the name suggests, as well as STI prevention. This program also allows for the development of kind of new and innovative approaches, because not only are they focused on obviously addressing unwanted teen pregnancy and STI transmission, but also developing like an evidence base for new methods that would be effective, and also just generally promoting positive youth development. Secondly, we have the CDC's Division of Adolescent and School Health, which is called DASH. DASH does a bunch of things, but they primarily promote environments where youth can gain fundamental health knowledge and skills, establish healthy behaviors, and connect to health services to prevent HIV, STDs, and unattended pregnancy. And so they have this program called the What Works in Schools model, which is currently in, I believe, 28 school districts around the country. And it's an evidence-based program that helps implement school-based sex ed designed to reduce HIV and other STIs. And DASH also works with state and local education health agencies to implement the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is a really important data collection tool for youth health risk behaviors that go beyond kind of sexual and reproductive health, but they ask questions about like the last time they ate a vegetable and things like that. And it's a really important survey to gather data on kind of the health of young people and what kind of health interventions would be most valuable. So there are a lot of committees to do with health. So it really depends on what aspect of health you're dealing with, the specific bill. So in the Senate, the Finance Committee has a subcommittee on healthcare that will probably do more to, as the name suggests, like healthcare financing and healthcare funding. The Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions that is probably the primary committee that health-related bills are going to go through in the Senate. And then when it comes to funding for health-related issues, we have the subcommittee under appropriations, the LHHS committee. In the House is not as straightforward as the Senate in terms of what committees deal with health. I don't know why they made it more complicated. So the Ways and Means Committee, similar to the Finance Committee, it's about healthcare funding. Energy and Commerce, they have a subcommittee on health. Weirdly, that is the committee that a lot of health-related bills will go through, which is so odd because when you think energy and commerce, you don't think healthcare, but I don't know, that's how they set it up. And then you have Committee on Appropriations, which is similar to exactly the same as the Senate. And then lastly, the Committee on the Budget, which is also related to the funding process. I'll pause here. Any questions before I keep moving? So as I mentioned earlier, this is like kind of more in depth, how to contact your member of Congress. If you go to this link, you can just type in your address and it will show you the names of your senators and your representative for your congressional district. And if you visit the website of each of your members of Congress, they'll have their contact form or email address, phone number listed that you can use to directly contact them. Excuse me. And when you do reach out, it is really important that you identify yourself as a constituent. Obviously, if you are reaching out as an advocate, they are still going to hear what you have to say, but they are really going to hear what you have to say if you are a person that has the power to elect them or not elect them the next time that they're in office. And if you're a person, in their community, or I can also say, if you do work in a committee, even if you're not a constituent there, that's also important to share, because even if you're not voting for them, you are working in their community and you are dealing with people who might be voting for them. So that's really critical. Also, they are much less responsive to people who are not their constituents, because technically members of Congress and their offices are really only beholden to the people that they represent. They're not required to, they're not required to meet with people like me who are trying to, lobby them. They're not required to meet with those folks, but they are required to meet with the people that they represent. So that really they cannot deny you a meeting if you reach out, and they kind of must acknowledge your email in some way. So this is a caveat. This is not legal advice. And this is definitely an area where I would suggest, depending if your organization engages with any like council, or you have like an HR person, they might know more about this. But if you're a 501c3, there are some limits on what you can do in terms of advocacy. So the most important thing is that you can't be partisan in any way. This means, you can't favor one party over the other publicly. Obviously, privately, there are going to be certain parties and offices that might be more sympathetic to your issues. You cannot get involved in any elections. You can't endorse candidates, things like that. You have to just remain completely nonpartisan. Things that you can do, for example, if a candidate is running for office and let's say, they have been really terrible on HIV/AIDS issues, you are allowed to say, hey, this, you can say that about the candidate as long as you're not tying it to their election, saying, oh, don't vote for this person. You can say, oh, my current representative has not been doing a great job on HIV/AIDS. Like, I hope that they would do a better job. So you can call attention in that way, but you can't really be seen to favor a candidate in the election. And then there's also limits on time spent lobbying. I don't think this is something that you guys will need to worry about, but just good to mention. And again, this is not legal advice. I'm not liable for what I've told you today, but I do think it's helpful to know. And so how you can help, these are kind of right now SIECUS's priorities. You can also definitely take a look at, I believe Maggie dropped them in the chat, but the AIDS Watch resources that go in a little bit more detail about what they're asking Congress right now in regards to HIV/AIDS. But I can tell you, since the FY 2025 process has kicked off, the ask for the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program is $150 million. It is currently funded at $101 million, so we're asking for about a $50 million increase. And then the ask for DASH is $100 million, and it's currently funded at $38 million. So, roughly a $62 million increase, a little bit more substantial. Lastly, you can reach out to your member of Congress about passing REA, which I don't know how familiar you guys are. Would it be helpful for me to go into the details of REA? I know, Maggie, you probably know. I don't know if others do, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'd love if you could just give a little overview on it.
Yeah. So we have the one pager in the chat, but essentially REA would be the first program to create a federal funding stream directly for comprehensive sex ed. And it would do this through a couple of ways. Firstly, it would obviously create federal funding stream for sex education. And something interesting to note is that I like to tell, community-based organizations is that a lot of REA funding community orgs would actually be eligible for if they're doing any kind of sex ed, if they're training sex educators, if they're providing sexual or reproductive health services. If REA were to pass, you would be eligible to apply for that funding. So first federal funding stream, first bucket is sex ed. And then the second bucket is around sexual and reproductive health services with a focus on, BIPOC marginalized young people. The third bucket is, the training and professional development of sex educators, because obviously, you can create funding to have these programs. Even if a state has great state legislation around sex ed, they might not have educators who are actually equipped to give comprehensive sex ed in the classroom. So this would, increase capacity in terms of, highly qualified sex educators. And then lastly, this REA would also defund the sexual risk avoidance program, the competitive grant program. SRA is essentially abstinence only until marriage, which I'm sure you are plenty of you are familiar with. And so SRA right now is funded at $35 million, and that's $35 million every year that is going towards abstinent only programs. That is not even the only bucket of money for abstinence only. That's just the bucket of money that's discretionary, meaning that the government can change the funding of it year to year. So REA would just permanently defund SRA and then reprogram that funding into comprehensive sex ed. Any questions on kind of these asks or anything else?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So these, your appropriations numbers that you have, are those for FY24 or FY25?
So it's the same numbers actually. FY 2024, in terms of where we are right now, we are very close to finishing. There are a couple bills. Congress passed one minibus. A minibus is like a combination of many bills all together. They passed one, and then there was some that the deadline to fund those departments, which includes HHS, which is where all of the programs that we talked about today primarily are, except for HOPWA, which is in the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The deadline for the government to fund HHS and some other everything in the Labor, Health, and Human Services bill is this Friday. They just released today the bill text that shows their funding numbers, which it is flat funded the programs that we care about. And HIV funding was preserved, which was really critical because the House was suggesting, I believe, $750 million in HIV cuts. And a lot of HIV/AIDS organizations really rallied and did a lot of outreach. Representative Maxine Waters did like did a letter. I think that had a lot of impact. So this FY 2024 should be wrapped up. Those numbers are flat funded. So the coalition asks, which are 150 and 100, will remain the same since the actual funding levels remain the same.
Thanks, that was helpful.
All right, these are all the slides I have, but I'm happy to answer any questions about federal advocacy. I only covered Congress, but if you guys have any questions about admin related advocacy, I'm also happy to help. And I can put my email in the chat as well, in case that would be helpful for folks.
Well, if anything pops up, feel free to just reach out. But I also did want to give you a second to plug, if any of these issues are interesting to you, you can go to Sex Ed on the Hill that SIECUS is hosting. I went in September in DC, and it was a really great opportunity to go talk to the representatives from, I was in a group with North and South Carolina, and we talked about REA. But if you want to give a little plug about when it's gonna be this year.
So this year, Sex Ed on the Hill is going to be virtual because we are transitioning from hosting it in September to hosting it in May because May is Sex Ed for All month. So there is going to be a ton of advocacy happening around sex ed. So I can drop the registration link in the chat. But essentially, Sex Ed on the Hill is basically an opportunity to not only get advocacy training, so there will be much more in-depth advocacy training than what I talked about today. You'll have a chance to, practice and learn how to actually go through a congressional meeting if you don't have experience doing that. And then we will have a virtual Hill Day. So you'll have meetings as if you were in DC. They'll just be over Zoom. Post-pandemic, a lot of offices are very open to meeting virtually, which is really great because it's made meeting with offices a lot more accessible. And folks don't have to come all the way to DC to meet with their members of Congress. So yeah, it's going to be a really great event. It's going to be a little differently structured this year because there's going to be a much stronger focus on preparing people that are newer to advocacy, making sure that folks feel like really confident going into their meetings. And we're going to have some panels on youth-centered advocacy and engaging with young people, since sex education is, we're not the people that are currently getting sex ed. It is young people for the most part. There's also going to be a panel talking about the parental rights movement and the culture war, and kind of how to address questions around that in meetings, because sometimes it does come up. And I think those are sometimes the more tricky meetings to meet. And Sex Ed on the Hill is much more affordable this year since it is a virtual program. And if you know of any young people that'd be interested in attending, it is during the day, so timing can be tricky, but it is free for students.
Thank you. That's so exciting. Like I said before, I went last year. I had a great time. I learned so much. And I think you guys did a great job of like preparing people. And I'm stealing some of the stuff for our own storytelling trainings that we're going to be doing coming up. But I do want to, while we're on federal advocacy, we all know some people that just went to DC for AIDS Watch. North Carolina had a pretty big delegation, I think almost 10 people, and they went up to the Hill and advocated for HIV funding, and it was really exciting, like Sydelle mentioned, to hear today that all of the HIV funding has been preserved, and HOPWA has even gotten more funding after they said that they were going to cut it all together. So Matt, if you are still here, if you want to talk a little bit about how AIDS Watch went, we'd love an update.
Yeah, happy to. It was a great day, as it usually is. I have had the pleasure and opportunity to go to, I think this was my 7th AIDS Watch. So I have been to a lot, and have had a lot of meetings with Congress, but Team North Carolina had 2 different teams. I think we met with about 12 different offices. Because the budget was so much in kind of the front of mind, especially with the, and I might be saying this wrong, but the current CR expiring, I think this weekend, there was a real push to kind of get the budget for 2024 over the finish line. So the majority of what we talked about was the Ryan White budget, keeping that where it was and potentially expanding it. And we really highlighted for the Ryan White budget the need for older folks who are aging with HIV, particularly as people are living longer. Issues are arising that people were not used to when they were first diagnosed with HIV. So the need for services for folks who are aging with HIV. We also talked a good bit about HOPWA. And then with some offices that we felt were a little bit more friendly to us, we did talk about some bills that we wanted support on, particularly highlighted the need for the Repeal HIV Discrimination Act, which would end HIV criminalization nationally, and I can't remember, the PrEP Coverage Act, I can't remember the name of it, but setting up a national PrEP program. So a lot of offices were really receptive on both sides of the aisle. I think really great conversations were had, and we're able to elevate the voices, particularly of folks who are living with HIV. So always a great day, always an impactful day, and we'll see. Maybe next year will be my eighth aid watch.
And if that got you really fired up, if this slideshow got you really fired up, NCAN does have scholarships for AIDS Watch. We gave out a few this year, so we'll do it again next year if we still have the funding. So just remember that. But if nobody has anything else, I'll give you this 6 minutes back. Thank you guys so much for being here. Next week, in 2 weeks on April 4th, we will be doing some federal advocacy. So we will be going over looking up our members of Congress and calling them about some issues that are important to us. So we'll probably be calling around some issues that Matt talked about. But if you guys also have things, please feel free at all times to bring issues to the action team that you're hearing in your communities so that we can, get together and do something about it.
And before we go, just want to let you all know I'll be at the 80th Full Pacha meeting next week. So if you all are going to check it out and have comments or have anything that you would like for me to address as a Pacha member, please let me know. I'm going to put my email address in the chat because I always go to community because I don't know everything. And sometimes I'm out of the loop. But yeah, if you have anything that you would like for me to address on behalf of North Carolina, I'm happy to do that. Just let me know.
Alicia, can you very quickly, just for folks who may not be familiar, explain a quick rundown of what PACHA is?
I'm sorry, yes. PACHA is the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. And what we do as a group is we we basically get I'm sorry, I'm on fumes. I'm so tired. I was going to say we make resolutions, but no, we take suggestions from the community in regards to actions that need to be made on the federal level as it pertains to people living with HIV. That information is submitted to the Secretary of Health, and then they submit to the president to see if either a resolution can be made or some change can be made. For instance, the big hype right now is molecular HIV surveillance. Many of us don't understand it. I've been in multiple trainings and I'm on the fence, but most of the time I listen versus giving my response. But PACHA was able to, create a resolution on behalf of community. But the final say lands with the CDC. They have to make a decision, and the community really wants no molecular HIV surveillance, but off the record in Alicia's voice, this has been going on for decades before I was born. So, they find many reasons why molecular HIV surveillance is beneficial to the science or the research that they do. But I do understand hearing from community about the concerns of criminalization as a result of molecular HIV surveillance. But at the same time, there's also not any, there's nothing that shows, or should I say nothing has happened. There's no evidence of any criminalization that has been done as a result of it. But, like I said, at the same time, I understand. But the most that the Presidential Advisory Council can do is take the information presented and hope that it changes from there. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
You're
Got some heavy hitters on the action team.
Absolutely. We're all shaking and moving.
Well, thanks again, everybody, for being here today. Thank you, Sydelle, for that amazing presentation. And, keep in touch if there's anything we can do to support you.
Thank you guys for having me, and feel free to reach out if you guys have any questions or you want to talk about sex ed.
Absolutely. Thank you. Y'all have a good evening.
Bye, y'all.
Everyone.